Economy class. Don't complain. This is all a failure like you can handle. The harsh shout of my brother Richard pierced my eardrums as a suffocating pressure crushed my ribcage from the inside out. He violently crumpled the thermal-printed ticket and threw it directly at my chest in front of dozens of staring eyes in the terminal. I cast my eyes down at the bottom-tier ticket, my chest suffocating, while my mother Martha hastily turned her face away, ashamed of her daughter's frayed clothes. He just stood there waving his platinum credit card around like royalty, completely unaware that on the other side of the city, our younger brother Kevin was sweating profusely as he begged the bank for a debt extension. He could go ahead and trample me with his arrogance, because he had no idea that in just a few seconds a single small action of mine would trigger the sentence that would destroy his entire life. Before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like this video and comment where you are watching from and what time it is, because the price he pays will certainly not disappoint you. The sight of my mother hastily turning her face away in disgust at my frayed jacket triggered a visceral snap in my chest. It was the exact same contemptuous frown that had suffocated me just a few days ago on Thanksgiving night. I had carefully parked my old sputtering Honda Civic in the darkest corner of my parents' driveway, desperately trying not to make any noise. Right in the middle of the perfectly paved lot, a shiny rented luxury SUV sat parked diagonally, aggressively blocking the entire main walkway. It was Richard's latest prop to flaunt his fake success. Pushing open the front door, the heavy, suffocating scent of roasted garlic butter hit my face, immediately clashing with the sickeningly sweet, expensive perfume wafting off my sister-in-law, Vanessa. The traditional family dinner had already been hijacked, transformed into Richard and Vanessa's personal stage. I stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds. Nobody turned around. Nobody said hello. My father was already seated at the head of the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose, nodding along to whatever Richard was saying, as if the words coming out of his eldest son's mouth were divine scripture. Vanessa had draped her designer jacket over the back of the chair directly next to my usual seat, silently claiming the territory. When I quietly moved the jacket to sit down, she shot me a razor-sharp glance and snatched it back, pressing the expensive fabric protectively against her chest, as though my touch had contaminated it. Richard leaned back arrogantly in the dining chair and violently tossed the heavy SUV keys onto the center glass table, creating a piercing metallic clatter that forced everyone to look at him. With absolute theatrical flair, Richard pulled a thick envelope from his tailored vest pocket and slid it slowly across the glass toward my parents, his fingers lingering on the paper just long enough to make sure every eye in the room tracked the gesture. It contained all-inclusive first-class tickets to Hawaii. My father Arthur immediately teared up. His wrinkled hands trembled as he grasped the envelope like a sacred relic, proudly patting his eldest son on the shoulder. Martha's face lit up with a sickeningly sweet smile. She quickly grabbed the carving knife, expertly slicing the tenderest, most premium pieces of turkey breast and piling them high onto Richard's plate. She completely ignored the fact that I had just driven 4 grueling hours straight from the logistics base with a completely empty stomach. Exhausted, I reached out my hand to grab a small piece of white meat from the center platter. Without missing a beat, Martha coldly swatted my hand away with her sharp silver fork. Her eyes narrowed as she shoved the dry, burnt neck and charred wing parts onto my plate, silently enforcing my place at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. She then turned back to Richard, gently dabbing the corner of his mouth with a cloth napkin as if he were still a precious child. Vanessa leaned over to inspect my plate, let out a soft, pitying cluck of her tongue, and whispered something into Richard's ear that made him bark out a sharp laugh. The entire table was a perfectly orchestrated performance of who mattered and who did not. I lowered my head, my jaw tightening as I forced myself to swallow the bitter, chalky meat. Your starving civil servant's salary is an absolute disgrace to the Flores name, Richard sneered loudly, tapping his expensive watch. You don't even deserve to walk next to me. He kept bragging about fake $1 million real estate contracts, inflating his empty facade. Martha nodded along, shooting another look of pure disgust at the frayed shoulder of my sweater. My stomach violently churned. It was the exact same look she gave me on my academy graduation day 15 years ago. That morning, she claimed a severe migraine to stay home, leaving me standing alone on the podium in a half-empty auditorium, where every cough echoed off the bare walls, only for me to find out later she had secretly gone to a champagne brunch to celebrate Richard's fake director promotion. I remember gripping my diploma so hard that day that the sharp edge of the leather case sliced a thin cut across my thumb. I had bled onto the white fabric of my dress shirt standing completely alone in an auditorium that was already emptying out with the sound of folding chairs being stacked echoing around me. Nobody came. Nobody called. But the most sickening part of the dinner was not Richard's bragging. At the far end of the table, my younger brother Kevin kept his pale face buried in his phone. His eyes darted nervously, completely avoiding my gaze. Kevin managed Richard's books. He knew the terrifying truth. The massive upfront payment for that luxurious Hawaii trip did not come from real estate profits. It was secretly funneled directly from the savings I had scraped together and sent home last month for Martha's knee surgery. Kevin knew Richard's company was drowning in massive leveraged debt, yet he sat there in cowardly silence taking his small cut while actively bleeding my hard-earned money dry to feed Richard's supreme delusion. His refusal to look at me was a silent, devastating betrayal that cut deeper than Richard's loud insults. Vanessa actively fueled the humiliation, letting out a condescending laugh and pointedly sliding her designer handbag further away from my chair as if poverty were contagious. She picked a microscopic piece of lint off her cashmere sleeve, held it up between two manicured fingers and dropped it delicately onto the floor beside my chair with a theatrical sigh. My mother watched the entire display and said absolutely nothing. Arthur continued chewing his premium turkey breast, occasionally glancing at the Hawaii tickets, with glistening eyes, completely indifferent to the silent cruelty unfolding directly in front of him. I sat frozen in my seat, my fingernails digging into my palms under the table until my knuckles turned stark white. I did not argue. I did not explain myself. I just quietly observed the rotting financial foundation of my family. They were frantically swiping maxed-out credit cards, completely ignoring the massive legal and financial deficit beneath their feet. Richard could keep thumping his chest and shouting his insults tonight, but I knew the heavy gravity of his own ruthless deception would soon pull them all down into total, unrecoverable ruin. That Thanksgiving night, after forcing down the humiliation at my parents' dinner table, I drove back to my tiny apartment. The moment the front door clicked shut, the freezing, empty silence immediately swallowed me whole. I tossed my keys onto the cabinet, poured myself a glass of ice-cold tap water, and walked over to the small wooden desk in the corner. My hands slowly pried off the lid of a rusted tin box. There were no highly classified files hidden inside. Instead, it was packed to the brim with neatly stacked bank transfer receipts. I flipped through the thin, fragile slips of paper, my eyes scanning the heavily printed numbers. Every single one of them bore the exact same recipient name, Arthur Flores, my father. I stared at the physical proof of my 2 decades of financial sacrifice, feeling a hollow, suffocating ache in my chest. The earliest receipt was dated from the year I turned 19, the first month I had ever earned a paycheck. I had sent home 60% of that paycheck without a second thought, convinced that a good daughter owed her parents every spare dollar she had. 2 decades of 60% paychecks, 2 decades of skipping meals, wearing patched uniforms, and declining every social invitation because I could not afford a cup of coffee, all so my father could hand that money directly to his golden son. Standing alone in the dim fluorescent light, I pulled out one specific receipt dated just 5 weeks ago. The dollar amount matched down to the cent the exact cost of that Hawaii trip deposit Richard had so proudly flaunted at dinner. My scraped-together savings for my mother's knee surgery had been quietly rerouted to fund a luxury vacation I was not even supposed to enjoy. Surrounded by the undeniable evidence of my relentless exploitation, I could perfectly picture what was happening across town. Right at this very second, my sister-in-law Vanessa was undoubtedly lounging on an expensive leather sofa in her heavily mortgaged rental house. She was probably wearing an overpriced gold-infused beauty mask, bitterly complaining to Richard about the sheer indignity of having to share a flight with a boring, impoverished clerk like me. Vanessa always used my forced frugality as a psychological tool, mocking my lifestyle as the fastest way to assert her superior dominance in our family hierarchy. That couple tossed money around like worthless trash, but not a single one of them ever cared that their lavish lifestyle was directly squeezed from my youth and my bleeding bank accounts. I slammed my water glass down hard onto the desk, my chest heaving as the air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. My trembling fingers instinctively reached up, gently tracing the long, raised keloid scar running down my left forearm. It was a permanent physical reminder of a supply truck rollover accident from years ago. That night, lying on a thin, cold gurney in an emergency room, suffocating under the pungent, nauseating smell of medical alcohol and ether, I had watched the fluorescent ceiling lights blur in and out of focus as the painkillers fought against the searing fire in my arm. The nurse had stitched the gash with 47 sutures. I counted every single one. When the last thread was pulled tight, I used the very last ounce of strength in my battered body to call home. I was desperately yearning for just one single word of comfort from my family. But instead of showing any concern for my agonizing pain, my father simply clicked his tongue and delivered a freezing, apathetic response. "A woman with a scar like this is useless. You'll never amount to anything, you're just an embarrassment to this family." That sentence had lodged directly in my mind like a paralyzing weight, carving out a permanent, unhealable hole. For 20 years, the sheer terror of abandonment had kept me chained, continuously exploiting my own labor just to patch up their fake illusion of happiness. But tonight, staring down at the very last receipt from last month, a wave of pure nausea washed over me. My lifelong sacrifice was never viewed as family love. It was merely considered the absolute baseline duty of a lower-class servant. I walked over to my closet, carefully ironing out the wrinkles in my formal military uniform. I smoothed my hand over the crisp, honorable fabric, and then deliberately pushed it to the far end of the rack. For the upcoming flight to Hawaii, I decided I would wear my absolute oldest, most worn-out civilian clothes. I no longer needed to borrow the authority of a uniform to shield myself. I was going to strip away all my armor and directly confront the ruthless cruelty of the people who shared my blood. I walked back to the desk, grabbed the entire thick stack of bank receipts, and coldly dropped them straight into the trash can. The soft thud of paper hitting the bottom of that bin still hung in the air when the harsh, piercing screech of my desk phone ripped through the disciplined silence of my Monday morning. I had locked myself inside the logistics office, burying myself in a massive pile of equipment coordination files. The rhythmic, steady tapping of my keyboard was the only sound cutting through the room. Without looking up from my spreadsheet, I pressed the speakerphone button. Instantly, the irritable, condescending voice of my brother Richard blasted through the small speaker, echoing off the narrow walls. "How much longer are you going to drag your feet? Hurry up and put in your leave request. The whole family is taking the early morning flight and I need someone to lug the baggage around for Mom and Dad. Your pathetic desk job has absolutely zero value compared to a single minute of me running my company, you understand." His shouting was relentless, completely indifferent to where I was or who might be listening in the hallway. I coldly pushed the thick data report slightly to the side, keeping my right hand steady as I penned the final serial numbers onto the ledger. I simply let the speakerphone project his endless barrage of insults and absurd demands. "I've got a land deal closing for $140,000 next quarter." He barked into the phone. "My schedule is packed, so you better put in that leave request right now." I recognized the figure instantly. It was 3 times the actual appraised value Kevin had nervously cited to my father last month. Listening to his aggressive, arrogant tone, I could perfectly envision the scene playing out back at my parents' house. Right at this moment, my father Arthur was undoubtedly sitting back on the front porch, with a hot cup of tea slapping his knee in pride. He was actively boasting to the passing neighbors about how incredibly important his CEO's son was, totally oblivious to the fact that his arrogant son's lifestyle was being entirely funded by my stolen savings. My family's delusion of grandeur was a highly infectious disease, rotting them from the inside out, while they desperately clung to a fake reality. Richard's patronizing voice crackling through the small speaker tightly compressed my chest, vividly reawakening a terrifying physical sensation from 10 years ago. It was during an extreme water survival test at the academy. I had been thrashing desperately, breaking the surface to gasp for a tiny breath of life-saving air, only for the instructor to forcefully push me back under the chlorinated water to test my absolute breaking point. Richard was doing the exact same thing right now. He was deliberately shoving my head down into the mud, suffocating my dignity, just to keep his own fragile, inflated ego floating on the surface. He was actively trying to break me, demanding that I humiliate myself by begging my superiors for time off, all so I could serve as his unpaid baggage handler and elevate his twisted sense of superiority. I sat perfectly still in my desk chair. My fingers gripped the cheap plastic barrel of my ballpoint pen so tightly that my knuckles turned stark white, yet my jaw remained locked tight, my expression completely rigid. I did not utter a single syllable of protest or defense. Let him scream. Let him bask in his fabricated authority. Every single arrogant insult he hurled through the phone line today was simply another heavy brick being laid onto the massive wall of his own delusion. And I knew exactly how structurally compromised that wall was. I calmly reached out a single finger and pressed the red button, abruptly cutting off his frantic shouting mid-sentence. The silence instantly flooded back into the office. I took a slow, tactical breath. His absolute peak of arrogance today was the exact catalyst that would soon bring his entire fraudulent empire crashing down into irreversible financial ruin. At noon that same Monday, I gathered my heavy stack of coordination files and stepped out into the brightly lit, sterile hallway of the main administration building. Before I could even reach the elevator, my direct supervisor, Colonel Marcus Hayes, was already standing there waiting for me. He silently reached out and lightly tapped the thick folder in my hands. Colonel Hayes was an incredibly perceptive and fair leader, a man who commanded the room without ever raising his voice. I could tell immediately by the grim, tightened look in his eyes that he had been walking past my office earlier that morning. He had heard the entire abrasive, humiliating phone call from Richard echoing through the speakerphone. He knew exactly how my brother had spoken to me, demanding I take a leave of absence just to act as an unpaid servant for my parents. Without saying a word, he motioned for me to sit down at a nearby wooden table in the quiet break area. He pulled up a chair and sat directly across from me, his deep gaze locking onto the sheer exhaustion heavily etched into my face. He did not offer any empty pity. Instead, he spoke in a calm, grounded tone that carried an immense, undeniable weight. Diane, you cannot constantly demand respect from strangers out in society if you leave the door wide open for your own family to walk in and trample over your self-respect. You earned your federal benefits through years of relentless grit, Diane, he stated firmly. You have every legal right to utilize your government travel privileges. Don't force yourself into a bottom-tier seat just to serve as a background prop for his arrogance. His words hit me like a physical shockwave, forcing my chest to physically tighten as the brutal reality of my own enablement fully set in. The colonel's blunt observation struck the deepest, most carefully hidden fear lurking inside my mind, the terrifying fear of becoming a total coward who refused to protect what rightfully belonged to her. This sickening sensation of paralysis destroyed my composure exactly like the time I was deployed on a severe flood relief mission years ago. I had been so physically depleted and severely dehydrated that my vision had blurred into a gray haze. I watched flat on my back in 6 inches of filthy floodwater as opportunistic thieves loaded an entire crate of crucial medical supplies, insulin, antibiotics, wound care kits, onto the back of a stolen pickup truck. My arms refused to move. My voice came out as a cracked whisper that no one heard over the roaring current. I possessed absolutely zero physical strength to fight them off. After that devastating failure, I had sworn a silent oath to never allow myself to be that utterly helpless again. Yet here I was 20 years later, voluntarily tying my own hands behind my back and willingly allowing my blood relatives to loot my dignity and my bank accounts without a single ounce of resistance. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold air clear my mind. I immediately opened my laptop, logged into the airline's internal network, and decisively entered my senior officer identification code to activate my government priority upgrade. I knew that at the exact second my steady finger hit the confirm button back in that moldy, poorly lit real estate office, Kevin was nervously sweating and physically trembling as he signed off on massive stacks of fake invoices, desperately trying to cover up Richard's massive financial deficit. The computer emitted a crisp, definitive beep, confirming my placement on the VIP upgrade list. My decades of silent endurance officially ended right here. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members just to protect your own sanity, please take a moment to like this video. Drop the word freedom in the comments below, because absolutely nobody deserves to be treated like a servant by the people they love. My decades of silent endurance physically manifested into the present reality the moment the departure morning to LAX finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the rented luxury SUV was instantly thick and suffocating. Without a single word of discussion, Richard forcefully shoved me into the cramped, claustrophobic third row, packing me tightly against the rear trunk, alongside a dozen bulky hard-shell suitcases. The legroom was so severely restricted that both of my knees were painfully pressed hard against the back of the second-row seats. Every time the heavy vehicle aggressively bounced over a speed bump in the neighborhood, a massive suitcase would slide over and slam sharply into my ribs, sending a dull ache radiating through my side. Nobody in the front rows asked if I was comfortable, nor did they offer to adjust the seating arrangement. To my family, I was not a passenger traveling to Hawaii. I was simply an unpaid piece of cargo brought along strictly to manage their luggage once we reached the terminal. Sitting directly in front of me in the spacious second row were my nephew Leo and my niece Sophie. These two children had completely absorbed their parents' toxic entitlement, viewing their aunt solely as an easy outlet for their disrespect. Leo, chewing a piece of cheap bubblegum loudly with his mouth open, suddenly turned around and callously threw the wet, saliva-soaked candy wrapper directly at my face. It missed my cheek and landed with a sticky thud on my lap. Immediately, 8-year-old Sophie clapped her hands together, letting out a high-pitched, mocking giggle. I slowly raised my eyes to the front passenger seat. Through the rearview mirror, I saw my sister-in-law Vanessa watching the entire humiliating interaction. The corners of her mouth curled upward with cold amusement. Instead of reprimanding her children, she dismissively adjusted her expensive sunglasses and lazily shifted her gaze back to the road. She actively chose to ignore their blatant disrespect, validating their cruel behavior as nothing more than a harmless, entertaining game at my expense. Emboldened by his mother's silent approval, Leo immediately kicked the back of his seat repeatedly, each impact jolting my already bruised knees. Sophie twisted around, pointed her small finger directly at the faded patch on my jacket sleeve, and let out a theatrical, disgusted sound. These children had been trained since birth to view me as something less than a full member of their family. They were simply doing exactly what their parents had taught them to do. Halfway to the airport, Richard aggressively veered the SUV into the drive-through lane of an upscale, overpriced coffee shop. He leaned out the window, casually waving his platinum credit card, and ordered massive premium espresso drinks for every single person in the car, except for me. As he handed the steaming, fragrant cups back to his wife and kids, he glanced at me through the rearview mirror with a condescending look of absolute superiority. "You work for the government, you should stick to bottled water to save money," he mocked loudly, his voice dripping with superiority. "If you get used to enjoying luxury, you'll just start making demands." He let out a booming, arrogant laugh that filled the cabin. I stared blankly out the window, completely unfazed by his insult. I knew for an absolute fact that this expensive swipe of his credit card today would instantly trigger an automated maximum limit reached alert, sending a loud, panic-inducing error beep straight to Kevin's phone in the accounting office by tomorrow morning. Following Richard's cruel laughter, my mother Martha shot me a cold, utterly disgusted glare through the center mirror. Her eyes held the exact same terrifying coldness that had frozen my heart during my high school graduation. That afternoon, she had aggressively brushed my hand away, completely ignoring me standing alone on the podium, just so she could fuss over adjusting Richard's silk tie for a family photo. Decades had passed, But her blatant favoritism had not diminished by a single drop. It had only grown more sophisticated in its cruelty. I shrank back into the cramped corner of the third row, pressing my teeth down so hard onto my lower lip that a sharp metallic tang flooded my mouth. I did not utter a single syllable of defense. I just sat there silently counting down the minutes on my watch. Richard could continue to thump his chest and dominate this enclosed space, completely unaware that the sprawling airport terminal ahead would serve as the definitive end of his fraudulent reign. The moment we dragged our heavy luggage through the automatic glass doors into the sprawling, brightly lit check-in terminal at LAX, my mother, Martha, abruptly slowed her pace. She aggressively reached out her sharp fingernails, digging painfully through the fabric of my frayed jacket, gripping my elbow like a vice. Pulling me close, she hissed through her teeth, issuing a strict command that I was absolutely forbidden from walking side by side with the family. "Stay behind us," she hissed venomously. "Your cheap clothes and pathetic appearance are going to ruin Richard's elite image. Don't you dare walk next to him." I did not argue. I did not even blink. Her fingernails left 4 tiny crescent-shaped indentations in the skin beneath my sleeve. I simply stopped walking, silently falling a few paces behind them, my heavy carry-on bag dragging against my hip as I yielded the spotlight. Richard immediately puffed out his chest, adjusted the collar of his expensive jacket, and wrapped his arm possessively around Vanessa's waist. Martha and Arthur flanked them like proud courtiers. The 4 of them strut in a tight, arrogant formation toward the premium service counters, a picture-perfect portrait of elite success. And I trailed behind them like hired help, invisible to everyone except the security cameras. At the United Airlines counter, Richard planted his feet wide, leaned forward, and forcefully slapped his heavy platinum credit card onto the smooth marble surface. He loudly cleared his throat, aggressively demanding that the female ticketing agent, Brenda, service his family immediately under strict VIP protocols. He deliberately raised his voice, ensuring his pompous demands echoed across the terminal, to draw the admiration of the tired passengers waiting in the long economy lines behind us. After snatching the stack of boarding passes from the counter, he spun around, aggressively crumpled the thermal-printed ticket for seat 42E, and threw it directly at my chest. "Economy class, don't complain," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute superiority. "This is all a pathetic loser like you can handle." Seeing Richard stand there, his chin jutting toward the ceiling and his hands planted firmly on his hips, instantly resurrected a terrifying memory from when I was 7 years old. He had forcefully shoved me into a cramped, pitch-black closet and locked the door simply because I had eaten a piece of his candy. I had cried until my vocal cords were entirely raw, suffocating in the terrifying darkness for hours. Ironically, at this exact moment, that same suffocating darkness was swallowing someone else. Across town, our younger brother Kevin had undoubtedly turned off his cell phone and was actively hiding in the darkest corner of the accounting office, desperately dodging the relentless barrage of incoming calls from aggressive debt collectors. Kevin was currently suffocating under the very same financial fraud that Richard was using to fuel his massive public ego trip. But standing here in the crowded LAX terminal at 38 years old, the childhood trembling inside my chest had completely vanished. The sheer panic had been entirely replaced by a chilling, hardened composure that froze my veins. I did not cower, and I did not look away. I stepped forward, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locking directly onto his arrogant, sneering face. The louder he screamed for attention, the more thoroughly he exposed the absolute emptiness of his fabricated life. I did not utter a single word of protest. I remained completely silent and perfectly still, my breathing slowing to a perfectly measured, even rhythm. Richard could continue to bask in the stares of the crowd. Sweat was already beading along his collar line, darkening the pressed fabric. His jaw clenched and unclenched in rapid, involuntary spasms. He was a man standing on a crumbling ledge, puffing out his chest for an audience that was about to watch him fall. I stepped forward, my posture rigid, and firmly pushed the crumpled boarding pass for seat 42E right back across the smooth marble counter. "I don't need this trash," I stated. My voice was not a shout, but the cold, measured cadence was sharp enough to echo perfectly, ensuring the dozens of passengers waiting in line behind us heard every single syllable. The sudden, blatant defiance completely caught Richard off guard. His arrogant sneer faltered, replaced by a flash of stunned anger. He immediately opened his mouth, drawing in a breath to hurl another string of vulgar, degrading insults at me. But I did not give him the chance to utter a single sound. Behind him, my mother's hand flew up to her collarbone, her fingers gripping the thin fabric of her blouse as her face twisted into a mask of absolute horror. She had never seen me refuse, not once in 38 years. My father's mouth hung open, frozen in mid-chew of the breath mint he had been working on. Moving with deliberate, practiced efficiency, I calmly opened my wallet, extracted my specialized federal military identification card, and pressed it firmly flat against the glass of the ticketing agent's optical scanner. It took less than 2 seconds for the airline's internal database to process the clearance. The computer monitor in front of Brenda, the ticketing agent, instantly flashed from the standard blue screen to a bright, overriding gold interface, exclusively reserved for senior federal personnel. Brenda physically jolted in her chair. The shift in her demeanor was instantaneous. She and her hovering shift supervisor immediately straightened their postures, their customer service smiles dropping into expressions of genuine, rigid respect. "Officer Flores," Brenda stated with utmost courtesy, "the system has verified your active duty senior status. Standard protocols are bypassed. You are instantly upgraded to first class with full TSA pre-check clearance." The supervisor leaned over Brenda's shoulder, double-checked the authorization code on the screen, and immediately straightened his tie. He personally stepped forward and handed me a complimentary lounge access card alongside my boarding pass. I did not gloat. I simply nodded once, respectfully accepting the freshly printed first-class ticket with both hands. The thick premium stock paper felt completely different from the flimsy thermal receipt Richard had crumpled against my chest just minutes ago. I held it calmly at my side, then slowly turned my head to look directly at Richard's gaping mouth. But my upgrade was merely the opening act of his destruction. Before Richard could even process what had just happened to my ticket, Brenda turned her attention back to him. The genuine respect on her face had vanished, replaced by a tight, deeply uncomfortable professional grimace. She cleared her throat and delivered the devastating financial reality with absolute, undeniable clarity. "Mr. Flores," Brenda stated flatly, handing the plastic back, "your platinum card has been firmly declined by the issuer. The terminal is flagging a complete block on the account. Please provide cash for your surcharges." It was the ultimate reality slap. I knew with absolute certainty that at this exact second, halfway across the city, that exact same blinking red "transaction declined" error was flashing violently on Kevin's accounting monitor, signaling the final catastrophic end of their financial shell game. The heavy blow of reality hit Richard harder than a physical punch. His previously smug face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly ashen gray. His dry lips parted, stammering silently as his brain desperately short-circuited, trying to find a lie to cover the exposure. The physical collapse of my family was immediate and severe. My mother, Martha, frantically clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with sheer, unadulterated horror as she watched her golden millionaire's son fail to scrape together a few $100s in cash. My father, Arthur, stood completely frozen, his jaw slacked open and his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. My sister-in-law, Vanessa, violently yanked the brim of her designer sun hat down over her face, desperately trying to hide her cheeks, which were now burning bright red with public shame. The curious stares of the surrounding passengers rapidly morphed into pointed whispers, smothered laughter, and utter contempt. Amidst a terminal packed with thousands of people, my family's humiliated silence was the absolute loudest, most deafening sound in the room. The sudden, crushing weight of public humiliation instantly boiled the arrogant blood in Richard's veins, mutating his extreme shame into uncontrolled, frantic madness. Stripped entirely of his shiny, wealthy facade, he fully exposed the core of his true abusive nature. His eyes turned wild as he screamed a string of vulgar curses, lunging directly at me, like a cornered animal desperately trying to regain dominance. He violently swung his heavy arm frantically trying to snatch the first-class ticket right out of my hand. When I did not flinch or hand it over, he delivered a vicious, malicious two-handed shove to my chest. The brutal push threw me completely off balance. I stumbled backward, slamming my ribs and shoulder blade intensely against the sharp edges of the heavy metal luggage scale. A loud, hollow thud echoed sharply across the check-in terminal, instantly silencing the murmuring crowd. But Richard had just made a fatal, irreversible legal mistake. Unprovoked physical assault within the public terminal of an international airport is an immediate, arrestable offense under criminal law. Almost instantly, the heavy, urgent sound of police footsteps pounded against the marble floor. LAX Airport Police. Captain David Chen, accompanied by a swift team of uniformed patrol officers, sprinted out from the security corridor of the terminal. They did not offer a single word of negotiation or leniency. Captain Chen raised his open palm toward Richard, his voice cutting through the terminal with the flat, mechanical precision of a man who had performed this exact procedure thousands of times. He ordered Richard to place both hands behind his head and kneel. Richard did not comply. He spun wildly, his eyes darting between the officers and the exit doors, calculating an escape that did not exist. Moving with cold, practiced efficiency, the officers seized both of Richard's arms with precise, procedural speed, twisting them behind his back. They forced him to his knees, then pressed him face down onto the freezing marble floor. The sharp, unmistakable clicking of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed through the terminal. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," Captain Chen recited with mechanical precision, permanently locking him into his own disgrace. Total chaos erupted within the family. My father, Arthur, clumsily dropped to his knees right there on the terminal floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please let him go. He's a CEO. You're making a mistake," he begged the unyielding police officers. My mother, Martha, let out a dramatic gasp and dramatically fainted onto a nearby waiting bench, unable to process the total destruction of her golden child. Amidst the screaming and crying, I immediately realized exactly who was missing. My sister-in-law, Vanessa, had completely vanished. I knew she was currently cowering out in the airport parking garage, frantically dialing every defense attorney in her contacts, completely panicked, because none of them would answer the phone since Richard's firm had not paid last month's retainer fees. Meanwhile, Richard's face was pressed agonizingly against the hard stone floor, contorted in pure terror, profusely sweating as dozens of passengers pointed their smartphone cameras directly at his pathetic handcuffed state. Staring down at Richard trembling on the floor, a vivid memory locked into place. He looked exactly the same as he did 20 years ago, when he was caught secretly stealing hundreds of dollars from my mother's purse to fund his own reckless spending. Back then, he had cried those exact same fake tears, cowardly blaming the theft on me, and my parents had eagerly believed him to protect his flawless image. That was the moment I first learned that truth meant nothing in this family, that the convenient lie would always be chosen over the inconvenient daughter. But today, trapped under the absolute, uncompromising weight of federal law, there was no silent scapegoat sister available to take the fall for his crimes. I placed my hand on the cold metal surface of the scale and slowly pushed myself up. A dull throbbing pain radiated from my shoulder blade down through my ribs, but I kept my face completely blank. I stood perfectly straight, calmly adjusted the collar of my jacket, smoothed a wrinkle from my sleeve, and gently rubbed my aching shoulder. A small red mark was already forming where the edge of the scale had dug into my back. It would bruise by tomorrow. It did not matter. I did not offer to pay his bail. I did not speak to the crying parents. I simply stood there, my expression completely flat and my jaw relaxed, and coldly watched Captain Chen drag my brother out of the automatic doors and shove him directly into the back of a flashing patrol car. The red and blue lights of the patrol car were still flashing against the terminal windows as I turned my back and walked away. Exactly 1 hour later, I stepped smoothly through the jet bridge, my shoes pressing silently against the carpeted ramp, and dropped my exhausted body into the plush, oversized leather seat in the first-class cabin. The insulated walls of the VIP section provided a profound, peaceful silence that instantly began to dissolve the decades of tension stored in my muscles. As I settled in, I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through the local news forums. The digital fallout was instantaneous. A shaky smartphone video featuring a fake, arrogant CEO being swiftly subdued and handcuffed by airport police had already gone viral across social media, racking up thousands of mocking comments and shares. That viral video was the catalyst for a catastrophic domino effect. Looking at the screen, I could perfectly envision the absolute panic unfolding back in the city. Right now, Kevin was undoubtedly sweating through his shirt, frantically shoving shredded accounting ledgers and client files into cardboard boxes before the bank representatives arrived with their immediate seizure orders. Massive contract cancellations were surely flooding their inbox. Every single business partner who had ever seen Richard's name on a document was now scrambling to cut ties before the viral humiliation stained their own reputation. Meanwhile, Richard, the man who had loudly boasted about his elite status just an hour ago, was currently shivering on a metal bench inside a freezing concrete holding cell at the airport police station, desperately waiting for a bailout miracle from the very sister he had spent his entire life abusing. My phone screen continuously lit up, vibrating aggressively against my palm. A rapid barrage of missed calls and frantic, tear-soaked text messages from my mother, Martha, flooded the screen. Her latest text glared on the screen. "Diane, remember our sacred blood ties. You must drop the assault charges and pay Richard's bail immediately. Don't ruin his career over a stupid mistake." Staring down at those desperate, manipulative words, I realized something profound. My chest did not ache anymore. The crippling obsession with being a good daughter, the desperate need to constantly sacrifice my own well-being just to buy their validation, had been an invisible, suffocating chain around my neck for 20 years. But today, that heavy steel chain was permanently snapped. Without a single ounce of hesitation or guilt, I pressed the power button, completely shutting off my phone, and tossed it deep into the bottom of my carry-on bag. I absolutely refused to throw a life preserver to the people who had intentionally drilled holes into their own sinking ship. A smiling flight attendant approached, gently handing me a glass of pure, chilled water and a soothing, warm towel. I took a slow sip, feeling the refreshing coolness wash down my throat, and turned my head to look out the thick glass window. The sky outside was a brilliant, spotless blue. As the heavy engines roared and the plane smoothly lifted off the tarmac, I finally soared toward a free sky that belonged entirely to me. Family should be a safe haven, not a toxic environment where your sacrifices are mercilessly exploited. You cannot heal in the exact same place that broke you. Forgiveness means letting go of the heavy anger, but it never means allowing them back into your life to hurt you again. Setting an ironclad boundary is the ultimate act of self-love. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member to save your own peace? How did it feel when you finally chose yourself? I want to hear your story, so please share your experiences in the comments below. Please like this video if you agree. I am Bronte J. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story.